For those of you who haven't heard Harold speak, he's an excellent speaker about Israeli politics, the Middle East peace process, a well-respected attorney who has written both extensively for The Messenger, for the Sarasota Jewish News and Sarasota and Manatee Jewish News, and also for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. Please feel free to go through the archives of the Sarasota Jewish News and the Sarasota Herald Tribune to see more of his articles. So thank you, Harold, for allowing me to introduce you. And Harold, I'm going to mute myself, and it's
all right. Thanks very much, Marshall, and glad to see everyone here. If I'm permitted a personal comment, I noticed that my cousin from Buenos Aires, Argentina, Roberto, is on this call, and we talk every Sunday together, and so I welcome you to our temple, Roberto. I want to begin with a reminder of the nature of the election process in Israel. It's totally unlike what we're accustomed to, where we vote for a given candidate and not for a party. In Israel, the election for the Knesset is by the party. Each party presents a slate of candidates. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. And when you vote for a party, you are voting for that party's candidates. You cannot split your ticket. Each party receives the amount of seats equal to the percentage of the total vote. So if the total vote were 100,000, you would get 10% you would get 10% of your seats in the parliament. Of 120, you would get 12 seats. So it's a proportional representation based upon your vote compared to the total vote, with one caveat. In order to get any seats, you must get at least 3.25% of the vote. If a party does not receive 3.25% of a vote, the votes don't count towards the total, and the votes are essentially wasted because you haven't made the threshold. And of course, there's an exception to that. Parties may enter into an excess agreement vote that if we don't make the threshold, those votes will be counted per our agreement with your party. And that may be significant in any election. So Israel has been confronted with 4 elections in 2 years. This is not a stable type of democracy when you have to have 4 elections in 2 years. Part of that has to do with the election system, that it's very easy to have a party with special interests, narrow interests. It's not costly. And if you can get the votes, then over 3.25%, you have representation. So there are 10 or 11 parties who go over the 3.25%, and no one party ever gets a majority of the votes. And the majority of the votes would be 61. The way a government is selected is you vote, and the president, one of his few powers, then selects the leader of the party, which has the most votes generally, not necessarily, but the one he thinks has the best opportunity to form a coalition to get 61 votes. And the candidate has 30 days after the election to try to form a coalition, and the time can be extended for another 28 days. And if that fails, the president can appoint a second person and go through the same process. So even after an election, it takes considerable time before a government is formed in these last 2 years. Before the last 2 years, there was never a problem of forming a coalition without going to a second candidate. So we're living in very unstable times now in Israel of personal politics, much like in the United States and around the world. So I think the best way of approaching the upcoming election, which is 1 week from today, is to look at the parties and how the polls are indicating the number of seats that each party is going to receive. I think the last poll was on February 14th. It didn't show very much change from the poll of February the 10th. So, Marshall, if you would put up on the screen all right, so what I'm going to do is first tell you what the issues are. There's one issue, one overriding issue. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been the prime minister in Israel for 15 years, the last 12 years in succession. The issue in this fourth election is a personality issue. It can be defined as for Bibi or against Bibi. Not an ideological vote, but it's a vote on the personality of Netanyahu, who is the head of the Likud party. So take a look at the poll on the bottom of February the 10th. You will see in there that the poll I've done is those who for Bibi, since this is a contest on Bibi and not on issues. I've sorted these polls into those who are for Bibi, those who have pronounced they're against Bibi, and those who are sitting on the fence to see how things turn out. So let me go down that list. Likud is a center-right party, more right than center. Its position on issues of concerning to the American Jewish community and to maybe the world Jewish community is one dealing with the West Bank. The West Bank, as you know, before the normalization agreements a few months ago with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain, Israel was about to annex Area C of the West Bank. Area A and B of the West Bank are where the Palestinian villages and cities are located. That occupies 30% of the West Bank. 40% of the West Bank, 60% of the West Bank, which includes the Jordan Valley, 60% of it is under total Israeli domestic, internal, and external control. And before the normalization agreements, Netanyahu was prepared to annex 1/2 of the Area C, 30%, and to add it to the greater Israel. That included the Jordan Valley land adjacent to the Jordan Valley, separating the West Bank from Jordan as a security measure. The American Jewish community as a whole, not completely, but the American Jewish community, the world Jewish community, much of the world opposed that annexation. And it was a very contentious issue. That was put on hold by the agreements with Bahrain and with United Arab Emirates. And so now we're in the status quo with the West Bank. And Bibi is campaigning. When I say campaigning on his personalities, he said, I have been very successful. Since the Intifada of 2000 to 2005, there has been no suicide bombers coming into Israel. There have been no terrorist attacks within Israel proper. We're providing security in the way we control the West Bank. And the fact is, the Israel and the Palestinian Authority have security agreement, despite their hostility towards each other on the issue of a Palestinian state. They have security. And the Palestinians are enormous assistance to the Israelis in maintaining this security. And the reason is there's a common enemy, Hamas. Hamas would like it dominates Gaza. It threw out Likud from the Gaza, and now would like to take over the Palestinian Authority. So there's a mutuality of interest, and it's provided security to Israel. 2000, 2005, the second Intifada was terrorist attacks, and it created a great instability and uncertainty among the Israelis. And so I would say today that the principal concern of Israelis is security, overriding any other issue. And so that is a big selling point of Netanyahu and Likud. His other point is that we have established a strong international relationship, not only the normalization agreements with 4 countries, but with many countries of Central Europe, good relationships with Russia. I am the strongest person on the international scene. So that's his principal argument, that he's a person of competence, that there's no one else with his ability who can keep Israel secure and largely welcome in the international community. Now you go to UTJ, the United Torah Judaism. That is an ultra-Orthodox party. Its essential concerns are maintaining its privileges. Its students up to the age 35 do not have to serve in the military. The Orthodox rabbinate controls marriage, divorce in Israel, controls Shabbat, so there is no public transportation. UTJ receives significant funding from the government for maintenance of its schools and maintenance of its programs, because its vote is vital to maintaining a coalition with Netanyahu. Shas is a Sephardic ultra-religious party, and it has the same policies as does the UTJ, which I have a problem getting those 3 letters out. But they are linked at the hip to Netanyahu. They have assured him and have entered into a binding commitment that they will vote for no one but Netanyahu to be prime minister after this election. Now, there's a new player in the game, a new party, the Religious Zionism. It is a Orthodox nationalist party and very right-wing. It's right of Likud, and is a nationalist party. It does not contemplate ever there being a Palestinian state, and it too is attached to Netanyahu's hip. And so you see, his group is 47 under the last poll. That means in order to get to 61, he has to get another 14. Now let's take a look at those who are his opponents. Yesh Atid is led by Yair Lapid, and it is a central It is a central party. They would accept religious pluralism. They are economic liberals, and they would be very much a center party. Lapid has said he will not serve in a Netanyahu government. New Hope, as a new player on the scene, New Hope is led by Gideon Sa'ar. Gideon Sa'ar is a very attractive, bright attorney from Tel Aviv, and he was a member for years of the Likud party. He is to the right of Netanyahu. He is opposed at a Palestinian state of any kind or nature, and would opt for economic benefits for the Palestinians, but not a sovereign state. I met during the second election in June and July of 19. I had the opportunity to meet with Gideon, and can certify to his right-wing credentials, certify to a very smooth presentation. He left Netanyahu because he said Netanyahu has created a cult of the personality. Netanyahu is only concerned with his own well-being and and with nothing else. For those who criticize Netanyahu, he in turn devastates them. Netanyahu will attack his own government. You know, he's under indictment for serious crimes, and he indicts the attorney general. He indicts the prosecutor, he indicts the judges. He is a divisive element. All this is the recitation from those who oppose him. So this is what I said in the beginning. This is not a campaign of issues. This is a campaign of personality. A personality cult, an authoritative figure, my way or the highway. And as a result, Gideon left. He was the upcoming star of Likud, the proposed successor, the anticipated successor to Netanyahu, but he resigned from Likud and from the Knesset. He started out in the early polls at a much higher number, but now he's at, as you can see, at 9 seats, 9 parliament seats. The next one with numbers is Israel Beitenu. That's led by Lieberman. It is a party of basically Russian-speaking Israelis, many of whom they're citizens under the law of return, because under the law of return, only one grandparent has to be Jewish. But under halakhic requirements of their mother being Jewish or having a Orthodox conversion within Israel, they are not registered they're registered as Israeli citizens, but not as Jewish citizens. Those who are not Jewish cannot get married in Israel. There is no civil divorce. They can't get divorced. If they want to get married, they have to go to Cyprus. Can't get married by a conservative or reform rabbi, which are small movements within Israel. So they're led by Lieberman, a Russian-speaking member of the Knesset, also former colleague of Netanyahu. He was Netanyahu's defense minister and had a falling out with Netanyahu, and in fact caused the collapse of the government, which led to these series of elections because he had the critical votes to keep a majority. But again, he's raising the issue in a very strong way of the call for pluralism in Israel. He said, we are a Jewish state, not a halakhic state. but he is very, very severe in his criticism, personalist criticism. And outside of those committed to him, he doesn't attract generally among secular voters. Blue and white. Now this is quite a fall and it's quite a story. Blue and white is led by leader is General Benny Gantz, former chief of staff. And when he went into politics and created the Blue and White Party, he was an immediate hit. Now we have someone who can provide us security without Netanyahu. He's a center party, and he was the same policies of Yesh Atid. In fact, Blue and White and Yesh Atid won 33 seats in the third election. Netanyahu could not get to 61. Benny Gantz said, even though I campaigned on the promise that I would never sit with Netanyahu in the same cabinet, he broke that promise. He said, I'm doing this for the good of the country. We can't go to a fourth election. We need stability. We need a budget. Israel has not had a budget for 2.5 years, even in the midst of COVID. And so he got 33 seats, but he couldn't get to 61. Why not? Because he needed to get 3 more, and those could have come from the joint list. That is the Israeli Arab Party. The Israeli Arab Party is never looked upon as an appropriate partner within Israel. Netanyahu has always condemned them as questionable, loyal citizens. And so it would be a kiss of death, thought Gantz. But even then, when he announced that the joint list was going to acquiesce in his being selected as a prime minister, he lost 2 of the members of his own party. So he still couldn't get over 61. Then he joined in with Netanyahu, could form a coalition. And when they formed a coalition, it was totally dysfunctional. They had an agreement where the cabinet members would be divided up. Each of them could veto the other's program, and that if a budget wasn't adopted by a given date, the coalition would be dissolved, and the coalition being dissolved, the Knesset would be dissolved. They couldn't get along at all. They vetoed everything. They couldn't agree on a budget, and really they couldn't agree on a budget because they were each using it as a political weapon, threatening to go to another election. And that led to this 4th election. Well, when he went in with Netanyahu, half of his party left him, and that's Yesh Atid. They were formerly with Blue and White, and they left and served in the opposition. And so now Gantz is at 4 seats, which is the minimum amount, over 3.25%, as is Meretz. Meretz is the left-wing social party in Israel, strong on support of a 2-state resolution. And Labor is a Labor Party, the former party of Rabin, and you can see it's been reduced to 6 seats, although they have a dynamic new leader. So those seats total 50. Now, the Jerusalem Post has a game. Make your own coalition. How do you form a coalition? If these polls are correct, how do you form a coalition? Let's take a look at the undecideds. Yamina is led by Naftali Bennett, another, I would say, right party, right of Netanyahu, and it's made up of both religious and secular nationalists who envisage a no Palestinian state. Naftali Bennett is not campaigning, and no one is campaigning. on the two-state solutions. Words don't come out. Yamina is campaigning on Netanyahu's cult of personality, what they view as his divisiveness, the way he's been handling the lockdowns in Israel, favoring the religious groups, they say. And so Yamina did not serve in the last cabinet because they would not sit with a mixed government with blue and white. And so they were in the opposition, even though they're on the right. But right now, they're the ones that can go either way. If they go with Netanyahu, it gets him to 58. That's pretty close to 61, if those polls are correct. So to show you how the politics play out, he might get some of the right-leaning members from New Hope. He may get it from the right-leaning members even of Yesh Atid to get up to 61. But there's even another twist. And this is like a game of chess, and I hope you can follow it. You see the party Ram. The joint list formally was made up of all of the Arab parties, four Israeli Arab parties. There were four of them. They had 15 seats in the last parliament, in the last Knesset. And their policies range from left to right on social issues and religious issues within their own community. But they thought it was best to have their own consolidated representation. Well, Ram broke off. Ram began saying, let's be a part of the game. Let's be a part of the political game for the benefit of the Arab Israeli community. So Ram has broken away, and it's just playing around at the 3.25% mark, getting 4 seats. Now, Netanyahu is the type of person that he will make arrangements or agreements with parties with whom he has differences, so long as he can then continue to serve as prime minister. It's been suggested that Ram and Yamina may join in with a Likud government and give Netanyahu more than 61 seats. There's a second way of doing this. If Yamina went in 58 seats, if Ram doesn't show up at the Knesset, when Netanyahu says we're forming a government, I got 58 votes, he only needs a majority of those who are present in the Knesset. And if they stay in their cars or in the hallways of the Knesset because he's made a deal with them, then he can be elected with less than 61 votes. So as you can see, this is a very delicate game. Now, you can't rely on polls. The last poll in Israel will be this coming Friday. They have an error range of around 4%. So you can see any slight adjustment can result in either party, either faction, the right or the center left, forming a government. Or going to a fifth, can you imagine, going to a fifth election, which would come somewhere around November, later in November. Now, if you want a little more interest, when Gans and Blue and White made an agreement, coalition agreement with Netanyahu and the right wing, it provided that Gans was the alternate prime minister. They created a new position for Gans, alternate prime minister, and he was going to rotate with Netanyahu in November. I won't go through how we got to November, rotate in November. So if the fourth election doesn't result in a government, and there's a fifth election, it's entirely possible that Gans, under that agreement, which is a basic law, will become the prime minister of a holdover government in November of this year. And to compound matters even further, if Gans isn't elected to the Knesset because they're just at the edge of 3.25%, there's a legal issue as to whether or not the agreement would still make him prime minister, even though he wasn't a member of Knesset. So you can see this. I use my one favorite Hebrew word that I know. This is a balagan. It's a mess. Now, if you think anyone else I can make a very good prediction. The outcome of this election is uncertain. That's one thing I can say with certainty, that the election is uncertain. And I double checked my own readings of the scene by talking with Israelis, including a political columnist who used to, who happens to be my cousin. And just on Sunday, I spoke with him, and he was asked this question. He sort of chuckled and said, "There's no one who can tell you what the outcome is going to be." I'm going to take one other matter. When I mentioned Ram, there was an article that President Eric read in the Wall Street Journal and said to me, talking about now Netanyahu, who has been condemning Arabs in the last 3 elections, the last 5 elections, now wooing them, which he is doing. He is wooing the Israeli Arabs by saying, you have special needs. You are living in a high crime rate. You're living in a need of social assistance. We're going to provide increased funding, increased police coverage, everything that you need in this effort to secure a few, that's all he needs, a few Israeli Arab seats, or an agreement with Ram that they won't come to the Knesset when he has secured his 57 or 58 seats, and he can then have a minority government with the understanding that Ram will always support his agenda. But that's a very delicate situation, because if there's a falling out, then the Knesset falls again. And if you look at the opponents, Yesh Atid, New Hope, Labor, etc., you have parties with different philosophies. You have the right-wing, serious right-wing philosophy, and then you have the center philosophy. And it will be a government which also won't endure very long. But a right-wing government, if Netanyahu is able to pull off a right-wing government, here are the kind of issues that have not been discussed in the campaign, which are out there. Okay, so there are issues out there that need discussion and resolution. The right-wing government of Yamina, when it was in the government, it proposed that the Knesset adopt a law changing the method of appointing Supreme Court judges. In Israel, the only check and balance on action by the Knesset is a Supreme Court. There's only one house, there are not 2 houses, there's no one with a veto. So the only entity that can check the Knesset if it should violate basic laws of Israel, the law of equality, the only check on it is the Supreme Court. And right now, the Supreme Court judges are appointed by a non-political committee. It's not a political process in the way it is in the United States. And the right wing wants to, has a law proposed to change the method of appointing Supreme Court, to politicize it, to give the Knesset greater control. Because the Knesset doesn't, it says, what right, it's a populist point of view, what right does a Supreme Court, 15 judges, have to tell us what we, the representatives of people, are doing is unlawful? And so it would weaken the Supreme Court. There is a way of resolving that, but it's an issue. The way of resolving it is to require a supermajority in order to overrule a Supreme Court decision, which is what they want to be able to have the power to do. And the way of doing that is require a supermajority. But it's an issue that needs to be discussed. It's essential to the preservation of democracy in Israel. So there are issues that are affected by the outcome of this election, which are not being discussed in the election process. So I'm going to leave it there. There are so many other issues that will just take up too much time, but ask questions on any issue, ones that I've covered or not covered, and I will do my best to help give some guidance and my own thinking on the subject.
I'm going to give the first question to cousin Roberto from Brazil. Okay, so I will read this.
Argentina.
Oh, buenos dias. Okay, so I will read cousin Roberto's question. Good afternoon, Marshall. I have two questions for Harold. What was the percentage of undecided voters on the February 10th poll used as a reference? That was the first question. Second question. Could the leader of Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, benefit from his independent image and prestige as a journalist to collect last-minute anti-Bibi votes? So first question, what was the percentage of undecided voters? The second question about Yair Lapid.
Well, I'll deal with the first question is, the polls only report on as I understand, the polls only report on those who stated a preference and did not include any undecided. But that's why there is also Israelis are known for not giving honest answers, particularly on the exit polls. On the second question, where will Yesh Atid, where will the Yesh Atid get those votes from? They're not going to get them from any of the right-wing parties, and so it doesn't reduce the Netanyahu supporters. If they get a few more, if they get a few seats, it's going to be from within, and they won't be from New Hope. It might be from blue and white. They may pick up some additional votes, but I don't see where they're going to materially improve without taking it from their own side. There's another question which I didn't deal with, is even if they had 61 votes, they have to agree on who is going to be the prime minister. And some of the leaders, for example, if Yamina joined with Yesh Atid, Yamina says, we're not going to sit with Lapid as our prime minister. So does that mean Bennett they would have to swallow their pride, having more votes than Bennett, and say, okay, Bennett, we'll do a rotation agreement. But so it's I think the opponents have a very difficult task of forming a government, and as does Netanyahu, unless these polls are way off, or unless the parties all lingering at the 3.25% mark fall below it.
Thank you. And thank you, cousin Roberto, for that question. Come on up and visit us in Sarasota. We have plenty of sunshine. We'd love to have you up here. A question from our ritual and event host, also known as Joel Service. What effect does all this mishigas For those people who don't know what mishigas means, that means craziness. What effect does all this mishigas have on the day-to-day operation of civil services?
Marshall, I didn't hear the last. Yeah, your go. I was looking at your lips and they fell below the screen.
Okay. What effect does all this mishigas have on the day-to-day operation of civil services?
It's destructive. There is no increase of funding from any of the agencies now for two and a half years. There are it just without a budget. Even the COVID is having a deep economic inroads, but the mishigas has created the mess, and it creates a problem on a daily basis.
Okay, I'm looking around now on the screen here, looking to see if anybody has their hand raised. I don't see anything from our esteemed, Mrs. President, the First Lady. I don't know if that's the First Lady or Mr. President, but please unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to wish Harold Yasher Koach. This was extremely interesting, and I particularly liked the analysis you gave of the different parties. It's very helpful as they change, and so that was really great. I have a question not directly related to the election itself, but it may have some effects. And that is, I read in the press recently that the Supreme Court in Israel has overturned the strict Orthodox rulings on marriage and other civil issues. Is that true? I need for one report. And if it's true, how will this affect the election?
All right. Well, first I'll tell you what the court decided. In order to become, as you know, you have a right of return, and every Jew has a right. Every Jewish person, including converts, have a right to become an Israeli citizen under the law of return. For that purpose, a Jew is defined as anyone who has one Jewish grandparent. However, that doesn't make them register. So they're registered as an Israeli citizen, but not as a Jewish Israeli citizen. Now the Supreme Court decision. So maybe a little further. So if we have a conversion in the United States by a conservative or a reform rabbi, and that person then is married in the United States, and the couple goes to Israel, they are automatically recognized as citizens, Jewish citizens in Israel. But in Israel, reform and conservative rabbis could not perform a conversion of someone living in Israel. A non-Jew living in Israel could not be converted by a reform or conservative rabbi. For 15 years, there's been a case pending in the Supreme Court, waiting for the Knesset to define what is a convert. What is the definition of a convert? So the court said, Knesset hasn't done its job, it hasn't acted. So for the purpose of the law of return, the law of return is applied if the person gets converted by a conservative reform rabbi in Israel. That conversion is recognized to create them as a Jewish citizen of Israel under the civil law, but it does not create them as a Jew under the law of marriage or under the law of divorce or under the law of burial. They are not, the rabbinate does not follow the law of return. And so it's a very limited ruling. It applies, they say, to about 30 people a year at most. But it's the first time the court has said a conversion of any kind in Israel by anyone but Orthodox is acceptable. So there's a great deal of hope that comes from that case, that the court is giving a hint of what's to come. The reaction from the Orthodox community, particularly the ultra-Orthodox community, was devastating. It was insulting. And they said, the United Torah said, we will not join in any government that doesn't promise that they will vote in the Knesset to repeal that decision of the Supreme Court. That kind of decision that the Knesset can override. It's not what rises to the level of what we call constitutional. So any non-constitutional decision by the court can be overruled by Knesset. So one of the platforms of the right will be to overrule that decision, even though it applies only in a very limited case. And what did Netanyahu do? There are a lot of Black African people who have come to Israel claiming that they are under threat of their life in their home country, and they're asking for amnesty in Israel because under international treaties, you grant amnesty to people who are under personal threat in their home country. And so what does Netanyahu says? This is opening the doors to be overrun by Blacks from Africa who are currently living in Israel, waiting the decision on amnesty. Well, that I think is an excessive fear, and it's one he did purposely to solidify his status with the right wing. But it's a very limited decision, but it predicts the future. Although most people don't think that the laws are going to be the answer that some have proposed, which I thought may have had some possibility of success, was that they adopt a civil law marriage and civil law divorce. And but the rabbinate is of no mind to change those. They're monopoly, by the way. So we don't think this is a right-wing created monopoly. The ultra-Orthodox in the rabbinate obtained their privileges at the creation of the state from Ben Gurion in 1947, when the partition decision was up before the United Nations. Ben Gurion was concerned that the ultra-Orthodox would object to the partition plan. So he assured them that their students would be exempt from military service, that they would continue to control the personal control marriage, divorce, Shabbat. Now, by the way, that goes back to the time of the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century, and then followed by the British Mandate that the several religions within the empire were controlled marriage, divorce, etc. And that was merely the status quo. So that was actually Ben Gurion, never thinking that the ultra-Orthodox would come up to 10%, about 8% of the population of Israel is ultra-Orthodox.
Thank you, Hal. Yes, Hal.
So let's speak about the ultra-Orthodox in another vein. And I'm going to give you a what if. If it looks like the non-Netanyahu camp can muster a coalition of some type, what are the chances you think that one or two of the ultra-Orthodox parties might buck Netanyahu and join that coalition so that they can still get money for their yeshivot?
Yeah, it's been suggested that might happen, and they have served in labor administrations when the labor government's first 30 years of the state were in being. So I wouldn't exclude that, except they're so close to the hip of Netanyahu that I think it is highly unlikely.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the screen. I don't see any other questions. Any last call for questions? If not, I'm going to turn the program over to Al Tridell for some final thanks, and to our president for some final thanks, to our speaker. So Al and Eric, the floor is yours before we close out.
Harold, once again, as usual, you have done a magnificent job in terms of edifying us on the political situation in the state of Israel. I suspect we may have you back after the election so that you can tell us what actually happened, and for that matter, tell us when the next election will take place.
Yeah, thanks, Al.
Mr. President. And you need to unmute yourself, Mr. President. We're not that good. My hearing aid is not that good.
There we go. Thanks. Harold, on behalf of all of us here tonight, I'd like to thank you for a really wonderful and edifying presentation. We all learned a lot, and it'll be very helpful as we tune in next week to see the election results. I think that you are our undisputed TBS Shalom Israeli expert, and we like your writing, what you do for the press and also for the messenger. So keep your articles coming and keep us informed all the time. So once again, Yasher Koach from all of us.
Thanks very much.
I
Thank-
agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending this lecture. We look forward to seeing you. Oh, congrats to Harold. A note from cousin Roberto. Congrats to Harold for an excellent talk, and thanks for the invitation. Best wishes from Argentina. And you know what they say in Argentina? Don't cry for me, Argentina. All right. So everybody, I'm going to zip off. Everybody, thank you again, and please keep your eye on the Temple of Beth Shalom bulletins for upcoming lectures. Thank you.
Marshall, that may have been the best comment of the hour.
Oh, no. All right, thank you.
Okay.